Picture this. You are standing in the suffocating darkness of an ancient Egyptian tomb. The air is heavy, stale with the mingled odors of resin, dried blood, and rotting linen. A torch sputters in a narrow corridor, its flame-clawing shadows across walls painted with gods who watch you with blank, inhuman eyes. Outside, the Nile rolls silently under the night sky, carrying the breath of a civilization obsessed with death, rebirth, and the unthinkable union of flesh and divinity. Before diving into these forgotten stories, consider hitting that like button and subscribing. It helps bring more of these unsettling truths back into the light of history. You are in Thebes, around 1250 BCE, in the reign of Ramesses II. To modern eyes, he is the image of a god-king. Temples, colossi, inscriptions carved deep into the stone of eternity. But behind that eternal facade is a man who turned grief and desire into a ritual system that blurred incest, necrophilia, and cosmic engineering. Ramesses lost his beloved wife Nefertari early in his reign. She was not just his consort but his advisor, his public mirror of legitimacy. Her death tore a hole in the ordered universe he believed he controlled. Egyptian theology gave him a path. If gods like Osiris could be resurrected through sexual violation by their sisters and wives, then so could the pharaoh cheat death by remaking his family in grotesque imitation of myth. That is how his daughters Bintenath, Meritamen, and Nebatawi were raised to the status of wives. The Greeks who came later, like Herodotus, spoke in tones of shock at Egyptian practices they glimpsed. Embalming rooms where young corpses were kept from embalmers' hands until rot set in, temples where animals were revered as gods, and even mated in rituals. They whispered of acts performed in Mendes, where a sacred ram was worshipped in ways that strained the line between worship and depravity. Strabo, centuries later, noted that women of noble rank were chosen to publicly unite with the living god in animal form. To us, this is bestiality, horror, humiliation. To them it was cosmic stability, the pharaoh's seed and the god's energy merging into the earth's fertility. Anthropology forces us to see it through their eyes. Sex in Egypt was not private desire. It was statecraft, magic, and debt repayment to the gods. The act itself was stripped of intimacy. It was treated as a substance transaction, semen as the seed of mankind, blood as the seed of the gods. To combine them was to feed the universe. Every Nile flood depended on this belief. When the king ejaculated into the river during ritual, he was not performing obscenity, he was fertilizing the god Happy, ensuring the land would not starve. If he failed, famine and death followed. What modern minds call filth, they treated as cosmic necessity. The line between sacred and profane disintegrated further inside the tomb. Pyramid texts and coffin texts speak with chilling clarity. The dead pharaoh, inert like Osiris, required sexual stimulation to rise again. Priests and perhaps royal women were commanded by ritual to make the king's phallus stiff, that he may beget. This was written as literal instruction, not metaphor. Imagine the chamber. The body wrapped in linen, silent and rigid, surrounded by figurines with grotesquely enlarged members. Torches burn, incense smolders, women wail in ritual grief, and hands reach out to activate the organ of a corpse in imitation of Isis raising Osiris. It was incest, necrophilia, ritualized and codified, but seen as duty, the seed drawn from the dead, feeding into the legitimacy of the living heir. This is where Ramesses II's personal grief becomes terrifying. He could not accept Nefertari's absence. He transformed daughters into wives, binding them into rituals where public ceremonies mirrored divine incest. Reliefs depict them beside him, not as children, but as consorts. In this logic, incest was not sin but purity, keeping divine blood within itself, imitating the gods who created the cosmos through brother-sister unions. It was sacred narcissism. The pharaoh demonstrating he was not bound by human rules but remaking the world by his will. Witnesses from outside Egypt struggled to even record what they saw. Herodotus recounts the tale of embalmers violating corpses. Strabo recoiled at Mendes's festival. These accounts were colored by Greek and Roman disgust, but their persistence suggests practices that horrified even cultures accustomed to brutality. What to them was cosmic order, outsiders saw as abomination. The clash of perspectives reveals the anthropological paradox. Purity and filth are not opposites, but twins. The Egyptians made the profane into sacred weapons, turning incest, necrophilia, and animal coupling into mechanisms for survival. The horror intensifies when you imagine the witnesses who could not speak. A daughter standing before her father king, told she must wear her mother's crown and body. A priest bending over the mummified form of his ruler, compelled to enact rites that crossed every human boundary. A noblewoman chosen in Mendes to perform before a crowd with the living ram of the god. They are silent in the records, their consent irrelevant, their bodies instruments of cosmic engineering. This is where the anthropological lens tightens. In a world where chaos, Isfet, was the true enemy, the body became the battlefield. The pharaoh's seed, the woman's womb, the corpse's organ, these were tools to pay the cosmic debt. The sacred was filth, the profane was holy. In their logic, nothing was too grotesque if it meant the sun would rise and the Nile would flood. And for Ramesses II, nothing was too unthinkable if it meant Nefertari lived again through the bodies of her daughters. The torches fade, the tomb goes silent, but the logic still chills across millennia. Survival at any cost, even if the cost is the annihilation of human taboo. The Egyptians left behind gold, statues, and temples, but also these rituals, carved into texts, recorded by horrified foreigners, half hidden in museum basements, where crude figurines with oversized phalluses lie in drawers. They are reminders that civilization's grandeur often rests on foundations of horror. Picture this. The desert sun blazes over the city of Mendes in the Nile Delta. The air is choked with dust, incense, and the humid stench of thousands gathered for a festival that is equal parts worship and spectacle. The cries of merchants mix with the chanting of priests. In the center, a ram, massive, jeweled, adorned with golden discs, is led through the crowd. The people bow, hands pressed to the earth, as if the god himself has descended into animal flesh. To them, he is not a beast. He is Baneb Jedet, the bar of Osiris and Ra, the divine potency incarnate. And at this festival, the ram does not just receive offerings of grain and flowers, he receives a bride. Herodotus recorded this in shock, and Strabo later confirmed it. A woman of rank, chosen or volunteering, stepped forward before the throng. She was dressed as a queen, her body painted, her eyes lined in kohl, her skin anointed with oils that mingled the scents of lotus and sweat. She was no victim in their eyes, she was elevated, transformed into consort of the living god. But what followed was a public act of bestiality, an obscene marriage played out as cosmic theatre. To us, it is depravity. To them, it was salvation, fertility for the land, continuity for the kingdom, proof that the divine energy flowed through Egypt itself. The horror is not in secrecy, but in how open, celebrated, and ritualized it was. This was Egypt's terrifying paradox. The very substances and acts we call filth semen, menstrual blood, animal coupling were recast as the purest weapons against chaos. Anthropologists call this the collapse of the sacred and profane. To Egyptians, there was no shame in the act if it kept the Nile's flood steady and the crops alive. What mattered was order, ma'at. Without it, famine would claim millions, and the gods themselves might abandon the land. The pharaoh mirrored this logic every year in his own ritual at the river. At the beginning of the inundation, he performed a solitary act on the banks of the Nile. Chroniclers whisper of it, the king exposing himself before priests, ejaculating into sacred vessels, and pouring his seed into the waters. It was a reenactment of Atum, the creator god, who birthed the cosmos alone in the waters of chaos by spilling his seed. In the pharaoh's hands, the body was not private, but a national instrument. His potency was not pleasure, but policy. It was demanded, scrutinized, sanctified, because Egypt's survival hung on the ability of one man's body to mimic the gods. Consider the anthropological weight of this. For Egyptians, sex was a form of debt repayment. The gods had spilled their essence to create the world. Humanity owed that debt back. Every drop of blood, every spasm of seed, was currency in the eternal struggle against dissolution. This is why magic, incantations, and even curses were saturated with sexual fluids. Love spells used semen, menstrual blood, and dolls pierced with needles. Curses commanded spirits to burn the liver, heart, and womb of rivals. In their worldview, bodily essence was raw power. To spill it was to enter cosmic commerce. But what if these debts spiraled into obsession? The texts speak clearly. Inside tombs, spells instructed priests and women to rouse the dead king sexually so that he might rise again as Osiris. The crude phallic figurines, catalogued by embarrassed Egyptologists, were not charms, they were tools for ritual acts of stimulation. Spell 534 of the coffin texts commands, "Raise yourself, O king, for you have not died. Your son Horus has acted on your behalf. He makes your phallus stiff so that you may beget." Imagine the scene: linen-wrapped corpse on a stone bier, priests in jackal masks chanting, women wailing like Isis and Nephthys, figurines grasped in ritual hands, the corpse's organ touched, invoked, forced into semblance of potency. To us, necrophilia. To them, divine resurrection. Now return to Ramesses II. He absorbed these beliefs into his own dynasty, but twisted them further with grief. After Nefertari's death, he crowned his daughter Bintenath as great royal wife. Reliefs show her beside him in festivals, bearing her mother's roles. Later, he married other daughters as well. This was not hidden. It was displayed on temple walls. In their theology, brother-sister unions of gods were holy. Father-daughter marriage extended the logic. If the essence of Nefertari lived in her daughter's blood, then Ramesses could keep her alive through them. He was not a father. He was a god remaking creation, binding his own bloodline into a closed loop. To him, incest was preservation. To us, it is monstrous grief made flesh. Witnesses saw and recorded fragments. Strabo wrote with disgust of Mendes. Herodotus noted the embalmer's violation. In Roman satire, whispers of Egyptian excess circulated as proof of barbarity, but inside Egypt, these acts were not scandals. They were state rituals, they were survival. It is anthropology at its darkest. What one culture calls depravity, another calls salvation. Step back and imagine yourself in the crowd at Mendes. Drums pounding, priests crying invocations. A woman leads a god-beast into the holy enclosure. The people cheer, believing that the act they are about to see will secure fertility for the year ahead. Children clap, elders bow, farmers cry with relief. To them, this is life, not death. Yet to us, from the safety of distance, it is horror given form, a collapse of human and animal, sacred and profane, that reveals just how far survival will drive belief. Ramesses Egypt institutionalized this collapse. His grief made incest into ritual. His priests made necrophilia into law. His festivals made bestiality into salvation, and his people accepted it because they believed they had no choice. Without these acts, the Nile might dry, the sun might die, and Egypt itself might dissolve into chaos. The fear of famine was greater than the fear of taboo. That is why the pharaoh stood above all, not as a king, but as a man whose body, whose grief, whose seed bound the world together. Picture this. You are deep in the Valley of the Kings, inside the suffocating chamber of a royal tomb. The torchlight flickers across walls, inscribed with spells from the pyramid texts, a script that whispers commands to the dead. The air is damp with natron, cedar oil, and the faint rot of linen that once clung to royal flesh. Priests in jackal masks stand in silence, their shadows looming like giants. Before you lies the wrapped body of a king, inert and incomplete. According to Egyptian belief, he cannot rise by himself. He must be aroused, resurrected, forced into potency so that his essence can pass into eternity. Anthropology tells us this moment collapses every human taboo. Necrophilia, incest, ritual violation, but for Egypt, it was cosmic engineering. Spell 534 is explicit. Raise yourself up, O king, for you have not died. Your son Horus has acted on your behalf. He makes your phallus stiff so that you may beget. Imagine the chilling reality. The corpse of a pharaoh manipulated, stimulated, his sexual essence conjured through ritual figurines in the hands of priests or women compelled to play the role of Isis. These were not metaphors. They were acts performed in the darkness of the tomb, ensuring the king's soul would rise as Osiris. Horror to us. Cosmic necessity to them. The presence of crude wooden figurines with grotesquely exaggerated organs excavated and then hidden away by embarrassed Egyptologists, confirms the physicality of this rite. These were tools, not charms. Their purpose was explicit: to reenact the creative moment when Atum, the self-created god, spilled his seed into chaos and birthed the universe. The tomb itself was designed as a machine of resurrection, fueled not by prayer alone, but by sexual magic performed on the dead. The political consequences were profound. By binding resurrection to these acts, the pharaohs secured their dynasty's survival. The ritual ensured not only the dead king's rebirth, but the legitimacy of the living heir. The seed drawn or invoked from a corpse was believed to pass into the next ruler, establishing continuity. What looks like desecration was, in their logic, the transfer of sovereignty. The corpse became an engine, the body reduced to a vessel for cosmic energy. Now step into the anthropological paradox: purity through filth. In Egypt's mind, there was no moral transgression here. The incest of gods like Osiris and Isis was holy. The violation of a corpse was not corruption but salvation. The categories we hold sacred versus profane, life versus death, body versus soul did not exist as opposites in their world. They were fusions, twin forces bound together. To touch the body was to touch eternity. To arouse the dead was to fertilize the cosmos itself. But Egypt's obsession with bodily fluids and sexual power was not confined to the tomb. In daily life, love magic and curse tablets weaponized semen, blood, and menstrual fluids. Archaeologists have uncovered lead curse tablets inscribed with commands: burn her heart, her liver, her womb. Do not let her eat or sleep until she comes to me. One spell orders 13 copper needles driven into a doll representing a woman. Head, eyes, ears, mouth, hands, heart, and genitals. Each puncture accompanied by a command: I pierce your vulva, that you will know no man but me. This was not metaphor. It was coercion by sympathetic magic, the body transformed into a puppet. Herodotus hints at this darker side of Egyptian practice, noting how embalmers were forbidden immediate access to fresh corpses of beautiful women. Families delayed delivery until decay set in, fearing sexual violation. It was a fear grounded in reality. For embalmers, contact with death blurred into temptation. Their hands, meant to preserve, desecrated. This detail exposes the fault line in Egypt's theology: when everything sacred is also sexual, when everybody is a potential vessel of cosmic energy, then the temptation for abuse is inevitable. What priests claimed as ritual became indistinguishable from profanation. Ramesses II's family provides a chilling case study. By elevating his daughters as queens, he collapsed kinship into ritual. Reliefs show Bintenath standing where Nefertari once stood, bearing her titles, wearing her ornaments. To Ramesses, she was not simply his child. She was a living echo of his lost wife, a vessel to preserve divine essence. Each ceremony with her was both an act of mourning and an act of incest. Each ritual touch, each public festival, reanimated Nefertari in his imagination. Egypt accepted it because their gods had done the same. But in reality, it meant that grief had warped into policy, turning a family into a grotesque performance of myth. The anthropological frame sharpens here. Incest was framed as purity, necrophilia as resurrection, bestiality as communion. Egypt institutionalized these contradictions because survival demanded it. In a land where the Nile's failure meant mass death, no act was too obscene if it promised fertility. Ma'at had to be maintained, the debt to the gods had to be repaid, and the repayment was always the same: blood, seed, flesh. The witnesses we have: Herodotus, Strabo, later Roman chroniclers could barely write without recoiling. To them, these acts were proof of Egypt's corruption. Yet, for Egyptians, they were proof of order. The horror comes not from secrecy but from celebration. These were not crimes committed in shadows. They were festivals, rituals, state ceremonies performed under the gaze of thousands. The pharaoh's seed spilled into the river. The woman joined with a sacred animal. The dead king's phallus invoked in his tomb. These were not hidden abominations. They were salvation itself. Standing in the tomb, surrounded by walls that command the impossible, you feel the suffocating logic of a world where nothing is forbidden if it promises life. The incense burns your throat. The figurines stare with obscene rigidity. The corpse is silent, yet the spells demand movement. And in that silence, you hear the collapse of human boundaries, the sound of a civilization so desperate for order that it sanctified horror as holiness. Picture this. The year is 1250 BCE, and the Nile has failed. The river's floodwaters, normally the pulse of Egypt's survival, have arrived late and weak. Cracked earth spreads across the delta. Crops wither. Villages starve. The people look to their king, Ramesses II, not merely as a ruler but as a living god whose body is expected to command the elements. He cannot admit weakness. He cannot appear as mortal grief and famine overwhelm his people. So he turns again to the ritual body his own, his daughters, and the body of Egypt itself. This is when ritual and politics fuse into horror. Accounts from temple inscriptions and later Greek witnesses describe the pharaoh's annual ceremony at the Nile. In public, before priests and nobles, Ramesses would perform the solitary act of spilling his seed into sacred vessels, which were then poured into the river. His body became the hinge of survival. If the Nile failed, it was because his potency faltered. If the Nile flooded too high, it was because his essence was excessive. The king's sex became national weather, measured not in secrecy but in ceremony. Imagine the suffocating pressure. An entire civilization waiting for one man's body to perform. The anthropology of this is stark. The body was never private. It was public property, a ritual instrument. To us, masturbation at a riverbank is obscene. To them, it was agriculture, hydrology, cosmic insurance. By reenacting Atum's first creation, the god who birthed the universe through his own emission, the pharaoh was literally inseminating the Nile, binding his own mortality to the flood cycle. The act blurred shame into salvation, profane into sacred. This is the Egyptian logic. To survive, you must sanctify the unthinkable. But Ramesses' obsession with Nefertari twisted this cosmic duty into something darker. Having lost her, he elevated Bintenath and later other daughters to the role of great royal wife. Reliefs show them performing rites beside him, their youthful bodies carrying the titles and duties of a queen mother. To Ramesses, this was not sin but duplication, the attempt to recreate Nefertari through bloodlines, to cheat death by marrying her living copies. Anthropologists read this as the ultimate collapse of kinship, daughters transfigured into mothers, incest reframed as resurrection. But in reality it was grief ossified into policy, a dynasty built on the grotesque theatre of mourning. The social consequences ripple outward. If the king can marry daughters, then incest is not filth but divinity. If the dead king can be aroused in his tomb, necrophilia is not desecration but resurrection. If a woman lies with a ram in Mendes, bestiality is not degradation but communion. Each act justified, sanctified, institutionalized, each horror celebrated. The Egyptians created a system where every taboo was inverted, not hidden but enshrined. In that inversion, they believed they held back the jaws of chaos. Herodotus, centuries later, recounted embalming practices that exposed the same contradictions. Families delayed delivering corpses of young women to embalmers, fearing violation. This was not rumor, it was policy, acknowledged in their society. To preserve purity, they allowed rot, sacrificing the ideal of perfect mummification to prevent defilement. But the myth of Osiris told the opposite. Isis violated her husband's corpse to conceive Horus, the avenger of chaos, which was purity, which was filth. The Egyptians lived with both answers, holding them without contradiction. The sacred demanded both. The horror is sharpened by silence. The records we have are carved by kings and priests, men who justified their acts through theology. The voices we cannot hear, the daughters told to stand beside their father as wives, the women chosen for Mendes, the embalmed corpses delivered after deliberate decay remain absent. Yet their absence speaks louder than the inscriptions. A society that collapses taboo into holiness does not ask for consent. It demands sacrifice, from living bodies and dead alike. Ramesses ruled for 67 years, fathering more than 100 children. His monuments stretch across Egypt, his face carved into cliffs and temples. But beneath the stone is a man consumed by grief, driven to bind his daughters into marriages that blurred memory and flesh, compelled to fertilize rivers and animate corpses with rituals that erased human boundaries. The Egyptians called him Uzamatra Setepenra, chosen of Ra. To modernize, He is a king who turned his family and his people into living instruments of his mourning. Anthropology names this system sacralized inversion. Filth becomes purity, death becomes fertility, violation becomes resurrection. The Egyptians accepted this because their world was fragile. One failed flood, one poor harvest, and millions would die. Better to sanctify horror than risk chaos. Better to celebrate incest than see famine. Better to arouse a corpse than let a dynasty collapse. Their logic was survival at any cost. But survival built on horror leaves its own scars. Greek and Roman observers recoiled. Later chroniclers used Egyptian rituals as examples of depravity. Yet for Egypt, these acts were never secret shame. They were public truth. The true terror lies in how normalized they became, carved into stone, recited in spells, taught to children as divine history. When the sacred devours taboo, horror becomes ordinary. And so you stand in the Valley of the Kings. The walls tell you stories of gods coupling with siblings, corpses rising through violation, animals worshipped as husbands. The silence presses in. The torchlight flares on painted figures of Isis straddling Osiris, of Horus avenging through semen placed in food, of gods swallowing fluids and spitting stars. The air itself feels heavy with transgressions sanctified into eternity. Egypt's grandeur rests on this foundation, that in their hunger for order, they made horror holy. Picture this. You are standing on the quays of Alexandria in the late summer heat, 48 BCE. The sea stinks of dead fish and tar, gulls scream over masts, and the city's lighthouse throws its cold geometry over a harbour clogged with Roman ships. The crowd surges toward the Canopic Way, as the queen appears on a barge dressed in white linen so fine it clings like a second skin. Gold rattles at her wrists, and a vulture headdress crowns her hair. She is not merely Cleopatra VII Philopator, she is Isis made flesh, a living promise that the border between human and divine can be crossed, and that the crossing will be sexual, ritual, and binding. The Romans who watch soldiers, envoys, spies feel something sharper than curiosity. They feel fear, because they have seen what happens when a state sanctifies taboo and calls it order. Centuries have passed since Ramesses II, but Egypt's theological machine still runs. The mythic template remains stable. The king or queen merges with a god. Fertility becomes policy. Bodies become instruments. Plutarch, writing later in his Life of Antony, will say that Cleopatra's every public appearance was an act of theatre calibrated to ritual. Perfumes poured lavishly, processions designed like liturgies. The queen staged as Isis beside a man who should be Osiris or Dionysus or both. Diodorus Siculus, compiling older reports, traces these themes back to the oldest stories: Isis reassembling Osiris, Horus avenging through seed and law. What began in the black chambers of Thebes, what was whispered by priests over a linen-wrapped corpse in the Valley of the Kings, is now exported into the Mediterranean daylight as politics, spectacle, war. Anthropology names this continuity. Sacralized inversion made civic. The purity of a people is maintained not by avoiding filth, but by weaponizing it. Body and soul fuse in the ruler's person. Debt to the gods paid in semen, blood, and public rites secures prosperity. Cleopatra understands this and weaponizes it. She does not need a tomb's darkness. She uses the sun, the street, the Roman gaze. The donations of Alexandria in 34 BCE, when she and Antony appear as Isis and Dionysus to proclaim their children rulers of eastern territories, is a state liturgy. Children staged as God's offspring, a queen enthroned as universal mother, the crowd compelled to accept a metaphysics packaged as succession law. No corpse is touched, no animal is mounted. Yet the logic is unchanged. The body of the ruler is the hinge of the world. The consequences are immediate. In Rome, Octavian shapes a counter-liturgy using words. He does what foreign chroniclers have always done when confronted with Egypt's sacred profaned politics. He translates ritual into depravity. Horace will call Cleopatra a fatale monstrum, a deadly monster in Odes I.37. Propaganda coins her not as queen but as seductress, a priestess of decadence who unmans Romans and dissolves order. The old Greek shudders at Mendes are reborn in Roman headlines. Where Herodotus once whispered about embalmers and Strabo described goat worship with disgust, Octavian prints handbills and reads speeches. The queen is a corrupter, The queen is an Eastern disease. The queen is a right that must be extinguished. It works because a sliver of truth runs through the slander. Cleopatra is dangerous, not because of magic in the vulgar sense, but because she carries forward Egypt's most potent political technology, the collapsing of taboo into salvation, and the staging of that collapse as public necessity. She claims that through her body, through her person, as Isis kingdoms can be ordered, harvests secured, heirs sanctified. In a world of droughts and mutinies, people listen. The Romans fear that logic because it is older and more intimate than their law. Law punishes taboo. Egypt eats taboo and grows fat on it. Witnesses multiply. Plutarch catalogues the feasts, the perfumes, the rumor of love potions and spells, Hellenistic euphemisms for the older Egyptian idea that fluids and essences carry power. Later, authors like Cassius Dio amplify the dread. The queen as queen of kings, as living idol who turns men into worshippers. None of them need to mention a tomb, a stiffening phallus, a ram in Mendes. The audience already knows the template. If Isis could reanimate Osiris, a queen who claims Isis can reanimate empires. What is Antony next to that? A vessel, a ritual instrument, like a priest with a figurine in a chamber of natron and cedar oil. This is the long aftermath of Ramesses' theology of grief. When a dynasty normalizes incest to imitate the gods, when necrophilia can be called resurrection, when bestiality can be called communion, a society learns that there are no permanent boundaries, only rituals powerful enough to cross them. Cleopatra inherits the permissions without reenacting the exact acts. She does not need to. The principal body is statecraft, sacred fused to profane survives. She fuses herself with Isis, fuses succession with staged divinity, and fuses international alliances with bedroom liturgy. The horror here is subtle. It is the horror of a political system where the ruler's flesh is not private, where citizens are compelled to be congregants, and where consent dissolves into ceremony. And yet, precision matters. Not every Greek or Roman report is literal truth. Herodotus's goat tale at Mendes may be slander wrapped around a garbled ritual. Strabo's confirmation might be observation filtered through disgust. Egyptologists argue over how explicit the tomb rites were, when texts are metaphor and when they prescribe performance. Plutarch writes centuries later with a moralizing pen. Diodorus compiles myths and official stories without always separating them. But even through the haze of propaganda and misunderstanding, the through line is visible in the material record figurines with obscene proportions, spells commanding arousal, temple reliefs elevating daughters to queenly roles, the implacable anthropological logic that treats body fluids as currency paid to keep the sun rising. The details can be debated. The structure cannot. The end comes at Actium in 31 BCE. Ships burn, oars drum like bones on a coffin. Octavian wins, and the Roman world decides that the queen's liturgy will be erased. Cleopatra dies in 30 BCE. How exactly the sources disagree, though the ass becomes the official theatre mask and her children are paraded as trophies. Isis's temple remains, and the cult will spread, transfigured, throughout the empire. But the queen as living Isis, the state built on sacralized inversion and public erotic sovereignty that Egypt is liquidated, rebranded as exotic vice to justify annexation. Rome writes the last chapter and files the myths as evidence. Now, step back into the present and listen to the warning embedded in these stones and texts. When a society becomes desperate enough, it will sanctify anything that promises survival. It will redefine filth as purity, violation as duty, and make the human body a tax instrument payable to gods or governments. It will carve this into law and teach it as virtue. The Egyptians did this with precision and grandeur. Their art is immortal because their logic was relentless. They were not hypocrites. They were consistent. That is why their horror is so clean, so cold. Picture this one last time. You are back in the tomb, the torch guttering low. Spells crawl across the walls, commanding the impossible. In the smoke you see a procession. A daughter crowned where a wife once stood. A priest's hand hovering over a linen, wrapped king. A queen stepping onto a barge as Isis while men forget they are citizens and become worshippers. You realize the pattern is not dead. Any age that mixes survival with sanctity can rebuild it in new shapes. The names change. The logic does not. In that recognition lies the only honest reverence for the past. Not admiration, not disgust, but vigilance. That is the cost written in resin and blood. When the sacred devours taboo, horror becomes ordinary, and once horror is ordinary, it becomes law.